There was a child in you who learned to read a room before he learned to read a book. He knew, before he had words for it, when the air in the house had changed. He knew the sound of a door closing too softly, the particular silence that came before an explosion, the exact temperature of his mother's voice that meant something was wrong. He became fluent in a language no one taught him, the language of other people's pain, because his own safety depended on his fluency. And somewhere in that early, unbearable education, a gift was born out of a wound. He became an empath, not because he chose it, because he had to. And I am going to tell you something tonight that will sound like a betrayal of everything you were taught to believe about yourself. That gift, the one that made you so attuned, so generous, so endlessly available to the suffering of others, was never the whole truth of who you are. It was armor shaped like open arms. And there comes a day, if you are honest enough to survive your own honesty, when you lay that armor down, not because you stopped caring, but because you finally learned the difference between loving people and disappearing into them. That is the story I want to walk through with you tonight. Not a story about weakness becoming strength in the cheap way that phrase gets used. A deeper story. A story about how the soul, when it has been wounded early enough and deeply enough, builds a whole personality around the task of managing other people, and how eventually, if fate is kind and the person is brave, that personality has to die so that something truer can be born in its place. This is the movement from performance to solitude, from the mask to the face beneath it. And I promise you, if you have lived even a fragment of what I am describing, you will recognize yourself before I am finished. Let us begin where the wound begins. A child does not arrive in the world needing to manage anyone. A child arrives whole, self-absorbed in the healthy way, certain of its own importance, trusting that its cries will be met and its needs will be honored. This is not selfishness. This is the natural entitlement of a new soul that has not yet learned to doubt its place in the world. But in certain households, and you know if yours was one of them, this trust is punished. The child cries and is told to stop crying. The child needs and is told the need is too much. The child feels and is told the feeling is inconvenient, embarrassing, dangerous to the fragile peace of the adults around it. And so something remarkable and terrible happens. The child, in order to survive, develops a second self, a watcher, a translator, a small, exhausted diplomat stationed permanently at the border between his own heart and the moods of everyone around him. This watcher does not sleep. It cannot afford to. It learns to anticipate anger before the first word is spoken. It learns to soothe a mother's despair before she has admitted to herself that she is despairing. It learns with a precision that would astonish any adult who bothered to notice exactly what expression to wear, what tone to use, what part of itself to hide. in order to keep the household from breaking apart. This is not empathy in its purest form. I want to be very precise here because this distinction will matter enormously later. What is born in that child is not the natural, overflowing compassion of a settled soul reaching out toward another in kindness. What is born is hypervigilance, wearing the costume of compassion. It looks like sensitivity. It feels to the child like love. But underneath it is fear, a fear so old and so constant that it no longer registers as fear at all. It simply feels like who you are. And this is the tragedy that so many carry without ever naming it. They grow into adults who are called generous, called selfless, called remarkably attuned, and they accept these compliments as descriptions of their character, never realizing that what people are actually praising is the scar tissue of a childhood spent surviving other people's weather. I want you to sit with that for a moment because it is not an accusation. It is a liberation if you let it be. You were not born an empath in the way the word gets romanticized today as some mystical gift bestowed on the spiritually advanced. You became one. You were trained by necessity, and what was trained into you can, with tremendous courage, be examined, understood, and eventually not erased, but transformed into something that finally serves you instead of consuming you. But before transformation, there is a long season of performance. Let us talk honestly about that season, because most people spend the majority of their adult lives inside it without ever suspecting there is a way out. The performance begins innocently enough. You are good at reading people, so you become the friend everyone confides in. You are good at anticipating needs, so you become the employee who never has to be asked twice, the partner who senses a bad mood before it is spoken, the sibling who mediates every family conflict, the one who remembers birthdays and softens hard conversations and shows up always, reliably, at exactly the moment you are needed. And for a long time, this feels like meaning. It feels like purpose. You tell yourself and you tell others that this is simply who you are, a giver, a helper, a healer. But listen closely to what is actually happening beneath the surface of all that giving. Every act of attunement to another person is, in the trauma-born empath, still governed by that same old watcher, the one stationed at the border of the self, forever asking one silent, exhausting question: am I safe yet? Have I done enough to keep the peace? Have I earned my place in this room? This is the performance, not lying, not manipulation, nothing so crude as that. A performance far more subtle and far more costly. The performance of a self that exists primarily in relation to others, that has learned to locate its own worth entirely in the eyes of the people it serves. You become, without ever intending to, an exquisite mirror. You reflect back to everyone exactly what they need to see. And a mirror, however beautifully polished, has no face of its own. I have watched this pattern in person after person, and I suspect if you are still listening, you have begun to see it in yourself. The trauma-born empath becomes brilliant at almost everything except one thing: knowing, in solitude, without an audience, without a role to play, who he actually is. Ask him what he wants, and he will tell you with startling ease what everyone else wants. Ask her what she feels, and she will describe with remarkable precision what the room is feeling. The inner world, the private world, the world that belongs to no one but the self. That world has gone quiet, sometimes so quiet it feels as though it never existed at all. And here is the cost that no one warns you about when you are young and being praised for your sensitivity. A life built entirely around the management of other people's inner states is a life slowly, invisibly emptied of your own. You can perform generosity for decades. You can perform strength, perform cheerfulness, perform the role of the one who always understands, always forgives, always has room for one more person's pain, and all the while, underneath the performance, something in you is starving. This starvation does not announce itself politely. It does not send a formal notice. It arrives usually as exhaustion that sleep cannot fix. It arrives as a strange resentment you cannot explain toward people you genuinely love. It arrives as irritability at the smallest requests because some deep part of you has finally, after decades, run completely out of what it has been giving away. It arrives, for some, as a full collapse, a depression that descends without an obvious cause, because the cause was never a single event, but the slow accumulation of a self continually postponed. If you have felt this, do not be ashamed of it. This is not weakness breaking through a strong person. This is the psyche itself, wiser than the ego that has been running the performance, finally staging its rebellion. Something in you is trying to get your attention. Something in you has grown tired of being the supporting character in everyone else's story and wants at last to be the protagonist of its own. This is the beginning of the turning. It rarely arrives gently. Usually it arrives as crisis, because the performing self does not surrender its throne without a fight. Perhaps it is a relationship that finally collapses under the weight of one person doing all the emotional labor. Perhaps it is a breakdown at work, a body that stops cooperating, an illness that forces stillness onto a person who has spent a lifetime avoiding it. Perhaps it is simply a morning when you wake up and cannot, for the life of you, remember the last time you did something purely because you wanted to, with no one else's comfort in mind. Whatever form it takes, the crisis delivers the same message, though it takes most people years to translate it correctly. The message is not, "You have failed at caring for others." The message is, "You have failed for a very long time to care for yourself." And no amount of applause from the outside world can substitute for the relationship you have been avoiding with your own depths. This is the moment, if you are fortunate enough to survive it, with your eyes open, when solitude stops being a threat and starts becoming an invitation. I want to be very careful here because this word, solitude, gets confused constantly with something it is not. Solitude is not isolation. Isolation is what the wounded child practiced in that house where feelings were dangerous. The shrinking, the disappearing, the making of oneself small and quiet so as not to provoke. Isolation is defensive. It is the self hiding from a world it has learned to fear. Solitude, the solitude I am speaking of, is the opposite. It is not hiding from the world. It is turning finally to face the one relationship you have spent your entire life avoiding, the relationship with yourself. For the trauma-born empath, this turning inward is terrifying precisely because the inner world has been neglected for so long. When you have spent decades attuned exclusively to what is happening outside you, the inside can feel, at first, like an empty room. You sit alone, without a role to perform, without anyone's mood to manage, and there is a horrible silence where you expected to find a self waiting. This is the moment most people flee. They reach for the phone, for the next obligation, for the next person who needs them, because the silence of their own company feels unbearable. But I want to tell you what is actually happening in that silence. If you can bear to stay in the room with it a little longer, that emptiness is not proof that there is nothing inside you. It is proof that what is inside you has been buried so long under performance that it has forgotten how to speak in your absence. Give it time. Give it the one thing it has never been given. Your undivided, unhurried attention, with no audience present to perform for. Something remarkable happens to a person who begins deliberately to spend real time alone, not scrolling, not distracted, not managing anyone's needs, but simply present with their own thoughts, their own feelings, their own unexamined history. The old patterns begin to surface. Memories you had filed away as unimportant return with new weight. Feelings you never had permission to feel as a child, anger especially and grief, begin to rise, sometimes violently, because they have been waiting patiently for decades for someone to finally let them in. This is not a pleasant process. I will not pretend to you that it is. The descent into your own depths after a lifetime spent on the surface managing everyone else's is one of the most disorienting passages a person can undertake. There will be nights when the solitude feels like drowning rather than freedom. There will be a grief for the childhood you did not get to have, for the years spent earning love instead of simply being given it, for the version of you that might have existed if the watcher had never needed to be born. But I will tell you, with as much certainty as I can offer about anything, that this descent is not a malfunction. It is the beginning of the only cure that actually works. You cannot think your way out of a performance-based identity. You cannot reason your way into wholeness. You have to go down into the material, the memories, the feelings, the old unmet needs, and let them finally be witnessed, this time by an adult self capable of holding them instead of a child forced to hide them. This is what solitude offers that no amount of company ever can. In company, even loving company, some part of you is still, out of old habit, watching the room, adjusting your presentation, calculating what is safe to reveal. But alone, truly alone, with no one to read and nothing to manage, the watcher can finally rest. And in that rest, underneath it, something older and truer begins to stir. The self that existed before the wound. The self that has been waiting this whole time, patiently, without resentment, for you to come find it. I want to speak now about what actually happens in that solitude, because it is not empty and it is not passive. It is, in fact, some of the most demanding work a person will ever undertake. You will begin to notice your dreams differently. For years they may have seemed like meaningless static, but in solitude, given attention, they begin to reveal a startling intelligence, an intelligence that does not come from the performing self at all, but from somewhere deeper, older, wiser than the ego that has been running your life. You may dream of houses with rooms you never knew existed. You may dream of the people who wounded you, not as villains, but as wounded figures themselves, tangled in their own unlived lives, which they poured, without meaning to, into yours. These dreams are not distractions from your inner work. They are the inner work speaking in the only language it has ever fully trusted: image, symbol, story. You will also begin to encounter, in this solitude, the parts of yourself you spent a lifetime disowning in order to remain lovable. The trauma-born empath is, almost without exception, brilliant at compassion and terrified of anger, brilliant at giving and terrified of wanting, brilliant at forgiveness and terrified of the simple, clean, necessary act of saying no. These disowned parts do not vanish simply because they are unwelcome. They go underground, and from underground they run your life anyway, as resentment you cannot name, as exhaustion you cannot explain, as a chronic, low-grade sense that something essential is missing, even when your outer life looks, by every visible measure, successful and full. The work of solitude is the slow, patient, often humbling work of inviting these disowned parts back into the house, not to let them rule you. An empath who simply swings into unchecked anger has not healed, only relocated the imbalance, but to integrate them, to let the anger teach you where your boundaries should have been all along. Let the desire teach you that wanting something for yourself is not a betrayal of the people you love. To let the capacity to say no become, finally, as fluent as this capacity to say yes always was. This integration is what the old traditions, in their own languages, called becoming whole. not becoming better than you were, not becoming more spiritual or more evolved in some hierarchy of enlightenment, but becoming complete, bringing together the light you were praised for and the darkness you were taught to hide, until the two are no longer at war inside you, but are simply, finally, both yours. And here is something crucial that I want you to understand clearly, because it will save you from a common and painful misunderstanding. This turn towards solitude does not mean the empath stops caring about others. It does not mean withdrawing from love, from connection, from the world entirely. That would simply be trading one imbalance for another, trading the performance of endless giving for the performance of untouchable independence, which is underneath often just the same old fear wearing a new disguise. No, what changes is not whether you care. What changes is the foundation from which your caring flows. Before you gave from depletion, from fear, from the old unconscious hope that if you were generous enough, attentive enough, useful enough, you would finally, at last, earn the safety and love that should have been given to you freely as a child. That kind of giving is a debt you can never fully repay, because it was never really about the person in front of you. It was about the frightened child still waiting, somewhere inside, for the world to prove it was safe. After the descent, after the solitude has done its slow work, something different becomes possible. You begin to give not because you fear the consequences of not giving, but because you have something real to offer, a fullness rather than an emptiness, a choice rather than a compulsion. This is the difference between a candle burning itself down to nothing in order to light a room and a sun that gives light, because giving light is simply, effortlessly, what a sun does out of its own abundance. One depletes, the other radiates. The trauma-born empath spends the first half of life as the candle. The great turning, if it is allowed to complete itself, transforms the candle into something closer to the sun. This is also, I think, why solitude and boundaries become inseparable at this stage of the journey. A person who has done the deep work of integrating their own disowned needs no longer experiences a boundary as an act of cruelty. In the old performance, saying no to someone's request felt like a small betrayal, a risk that love itself might be withdrawn as punishment. But once you have gone down into your own depths and met the frightened child who built that fear, you begin to understand something the child could never have understood, that a boundary is not the opposite of love. A boundary is what makes love sustainable. Without it, giving becomes resentment in slow motion. With it, giving becomes a gift instead of a debt. I want to talk too about the loneliness that accompanies this passage, because I will not romanticize it away. Choosing solitude over performance often means, at least for a season, choosing distance from relationships that were built entirely on the old dynamic. relationships where you were valued specifically for your endless availability, your endless understanding, your endless capacity to absorb what others could not hold themselves. When you stop performing that role, some of these relationships will not survive the change. People who benefited from your depletion will often, without ever consciously admitting it, resist your healing. They will call your new boundaries coldness. They will call your need for solitude selfishness. They will, in subtle and not so subtle ways, try to summon the old performer back, because the old performer was, for them, extremely convenient. This is one of the hardest truths of the entire passage, and I want to say it plainly so you are not blindsided by it the way so many are. Not everyone will celebrate your wholeness. Some people only ever loved your performance, and letting that be true without bitterness, without needing to punish anyone for it, is itself part of the integration. You are not owed everyone's approval of your healing. You are only owed the truth of your own becoming. But I also want to tell you, because it is equally true, that the relationships which survive this passage, the ones that do not merely tolerate your new boundaries, but actually welcome the fuller, less performative version of you, those relationships become something the old performance could never have produced. They become mutual instead of one-sided. They become rooms where you can finally be met rather than merely useful. This is the quiet reward waiting on the other side of the loneliness. Not more people necessarily, but truer ones. Not a wider audience, but real company. There is an old figure that appears across nearly every culture's stories, in one form or another, the healer who is himself wounded, who carries within his own body the very affliction he has learned to treat in others. I have always found this image extraordinarily precise as a description of what we are discussing tonight. The trauma-born empath is, in a sense, this wounded healer in embryo. The sensitivity born from early pain becomes, if it is finally examined and integrated rather than merely performed, a genuine capacity to understand suffering from the inside, not as a technique, not as a role, but as lived knowledge. The tragedy is when the healer never tends his own wound, when he spends his entire life extending care outward, while the source of his own pain goes forever unexamined. He becomes brilliant at helping others survive what he himself has never actually processed, and eventually this this arrangement collapses under its own weight, because you cannot indefinitely pour from a well you refuse to let anyone, including yourself, look into. But when the wound is finally tended, in the solitude, in the descent, in the slow integration of everything that was once too dangerous to feel, something changes in the quality of the help this person is able to offer. It is no longer help extended from fear, from the old need to be needed. It becomes help extended from genuine understanding, offered freely, without the desperate undertow of a person still trying to save themselves by saving everyone else first. This is the difference between a wound that manages others and a wound that has become wisdom. I do not say any of this to suggest that the goal of this entire passage is to become a helper of others in some grand redemptive sense. That would simply be another performance, dressed up more nobly. The goal, if there is one word for it, is wholeness, a life lived from the center of your own being, rather than from the anxious periphery of everyone else's expectations. Whether that wholeness eventually expresses itself in helping others, in solitary creative work, in quiet ordinary living, in relationships finally built on mutual presence rather than one-sided management. That is not something anyone else can prescribe for you. That is precisely the point. For the first time, the answer to what your life should look like has to come from inside you, because for the first time, there is a genuine insight to consult. There is something else that tends to arrive in this solitude, and I would be leaving out an essential part of the story if I did not mention it. Many who make this passage discover, almost by accident, that the same sensitivity which once made them so skilled at reading other people begins to find a new direction entirely toward making something. A painting, a piece of music, a page of writing, a garden tended with unusual care, a craft practiced for no reason except that the hands wanted to do it. This is not a coincidence, and it is not a minor detail. The energy that was once spent entirely on monitoring the emotional weather of other people has to go somewhere when it is finally freed from that task, and very often it flows quite naturally into creation. I want you to understand why this matters so much. Performance, as I have described it tonight, is a kind of creativity turned entirely outward and entirely reactive, shaping yourself, moment to moment, into whatever the room requires. It is exhausting, precisely, because it is endless improvisation with no script of your own. Genuine creative work, by contrast, is a kind of solitude made visible. No one is telling the painter what the canvas requires. No one is telling the writer what the page needs to hear. For perhaps the first time, the trauma-born empath gets to ask a question that the performing self was never permitted to ask, not what does this room need from me, but what wants to come through me. This is a small question with an enormous weight behind it, because it is quite simply the sound of a person finally listening to themselves instead of everyone else. Do not mistake what I am describing for a demand that you must become an artist in order to heal. That is not the point at all. The point is much simpler and much stranger. That a life reorganized around your own inner voice rather than around the anticipated needs of others tends to become more alive in every direction, not only the direction you expected. People who make this passage often report, almost sheepishly, that colors seem more vivid, that music lands differently in the body, that ordinary moments, a walk taken alone, a meal eaten in silence, a morning with nothing scheduled, begin to carry a weight and richness they never had before. This is not mysticism. It is simply what happens when a person who has spent decades living on the surface of themselves finally moves back in and starts occupying the whole house. And there is a particular kind of guidance that becomes available once you are living from that inner ground rather than from constant outward vigilance. A sense difficult to describe to anyone who has not experienced it, of certain events, certain meetings, certain books falling into your hands at precisely the moment you needed them, as though the world itself had begun responding to your inner state rather than the other way around. I will not claim to explain this fully. I will only say that those who do the deep work of solitude tend to notice it consistently and tend to trust it more and more as their own inner authority grows stronger. It is as though the psyche, once it is finally being listened to, begins speaking not only through dreams and feelings, but through the shape of a life being lived in genuine alignment with itself. I want to say something now about time, because this is a passage that resists every modern instinct towards speed. There is no technique that shortcuts this. There is no single retreat, no single insight, no single conversation that completes it. The performance took years, sometimes decades, to construct layer by layer in response to 1,000 small moments of learning what was safe to show and what had to be hidden. The undoing of that architecture takes its own time as well, and it cannot be rushed by willpower any more than a wound can be healed faster by simply wanting it to close. This is, I think, one of the great mercies hidden inside the difficulty of the process. Because it cannot be rushed, it forces you to develop precisely the quality the old performance never allowed you to have: patience with yourself. The child who became an empath learned to be endlessly patient with everyone else's timeline, everyone else's moods, everyone else's process, while being given no patience whatsoever for their own. Learning finally in adulthood to extend that same patience inward, to let your own healing take the years it actually needs rather than the weeks you wish it took, is itself one of the deepest acts of self-restoration available to a person. And so solitude, over time, stops being something you retreat into during a crisis and becomes something closer to a practice, a discipline, even a kind of devotion. Not solitude as punishment, not solitude as hiding, but solitude as the regular, deliberate return to your own depths, the way a person might return again and again to a well they have learned to trust. You begin to protect time alone, the way you once protected other people's comfort, fiercely, without apology, because you have finally understood that this time is not selfish indulgence, but the very foundation on which everything else you value depends. I want to close with something that I think matters more than anything else I have said tonight, because it is easy in a talk like this to make the ending sound like arrival, as though one day the work is finished, the performance fully retired, the solitude fully integrated, and life proceeds afterward in some permanent state of wholeness. That is not how this actually works, and I would be doing you a disservice to suggest otherwise. The truth is closer to this. The performance will try to return, especially in moments of stress, especially around the people who most rewarded your old patterns, especially when an old fear is triggered, and the fastest, most familiar relief available is to slip back into managing, pleasing, disappearing into someone else's needs. This is not failure when it happens. This is simply the old architecture, built over years, occasionally reasserting itself out of habit. The difference, after the deep work of solitude has been done, is that you will notice it faster. You will recognize the old watcher stepping back onto the stage, and you will have, for the first time, the capacity to gently, without self-punishment, invite it to step back down. This is what a lived integration actually looks like. Not perfection, not permanent freedom from the old patterns, but a growing, deepening relationship with yourself that allows you to catch the performance earlier and return more quickly each time to the truer ground beneath it. Wholeness is not a destination you arrive at once and keep forever. It is a practice you return to again and again for the rest of your life, the way a musician returns to practice even after mastering an instrument, not because the mastery is incomplete, but because that is simply what a living relationship with anything precious requires. So, let me leave you with this, because I suspect some of you came here tonight already knowing, somewhere underneath everything else, exactly why this talk found you. If you were the child who learned to read a room before you learned to read a book, if you became the friend everyone confides in, and the person no one ever thinks to ask how they are doing, if you have spent years mistaking exhaustion for love and performance for purpose, I want you to know that the ache you feel, the quiet, persistent sense that something essential has gone missing from your own life, even as you have given so generously to everyone else's, is not a flaw in you. It is your own depths, finally, after all these years, asking to be let back in. You do not owe the world a permanent performance of endless availability in order to deserve your place in it. You were never actually required to earn love by disappearing into everyone else's needs. That was a lesson written into you by circumstances that were never your fault, and it can, with time, with courage, with the patient willingness to sit alone with what you find there, be unwritten. Choose the solitude, not as a rejection of the people you love, but as the necessary return to the one relationship that makes every other relationship in your life sustainable. Go down into what you have been avoiding. Meet the child who built the watcher. Thank that child because it kept you alive with the only tools it had, and then gently let it finally rest. What waits for you on the other side of that descent is not a smaller life. It is not a life of isolation, of coldness, of withdrawal from a world that still genuinely needs the extraordinary sensitivity you carry. What waits for you is a fuller life, one where your giving comes from abundance instead of fear, where your presence with others is a gift instead of a debt, where the very sensitivity that once nearly consumed you becomes finally integrated, undefended, and entirely your own. You were never meant to spend your whole life as a mirror for everyone else's face. You have a face of your own. It has been waiting for you this entire time, patiently, in the silence you have been too frightened to enter. Go and meet it. There is no performance on earth as important as that meeting, and no audience you will ever need more than the one person who has been waiting alone for you to finally come home.